Nobody warned her about the silence. The job posting had said 3 things: housemaid wanted, experienced, discreet. That was it. No other details, no name, no description of the house or the man living inside it. Clara Webb read those 11 words on a piece of paper pinned to a board outside a dry goods store in Richmond, and she stood there for a long moment in the cold November air, and she thought, this is the one. Not because it sounded promising, because she had run out of everything else. She arrived at 9 Ashton Lane on a Wednesday morning, carrying a worn traveling bag that held almost everything she owned, which was not very much. She had a spare dress, a pair of good gloves with one small tear at the left thumb, a bundle of letters from her sister Ruth, and a letter of reference she had written herself. Every word of it was true. She had simply written it because the person who was supposed to write it no longer had a household to write it from. The house stopped her at the gate. It rose up behind iron bars, the way old Richmond houses always did, as if it had been standing there so long it had stopped noticing time passing. The walls were dark brick. The windows were tall and narrow. Old elm trees lined the path from the gate to the front door, their bare branches reaching toward each other overhead like hands almost touching. It was a beautiful house. Clara noticed this the way she had learned to notice beautiful things from a careful distance, understanding that beauty and belonging were not the same thing at all. The gate opened before she could knock. The woman who opened it was broad and gray-haired, with the sharp eyes of someone who had been doing a very tiring job for a very long time. Her name was Mrs. Thorne. She was the housekeeper. She looked Clara over from boot to collar in about 4 seconds and said, "You're the last one today. Come in." Clara followed her up the path. "How many positions are you filling?" "1." Mrs. Thorne did not slow her pace. The last maid left without notice. "Why?" Mrs. Thorne paused exactly 1 step before she answered. "The general is particular." "What does that mean?" "It means he keeps a precise house. He does not speak before 7 in the morning. He notices everything. The last girl found it difficult to work under that kind of attention." She pushed open the front door. The one before her found it lonely. The one before that found it frightening. None of them lasted 3 weeks. Clara stepped inside and looked around. The entry hall was high-ceilinged and very clean. A wide staircase rose to the upper floors. A door to the left sat partially open, showing the edge of a desk covered in stacked papers. Everything in the house looked ordered and tended and deeply, specifically quiet. "I am not easily frightened," Clara said. Mrs. Thorne looked at her with an expression that was not unkind. "I didn't say you were. I said the others were." She moved toward the staircase. "The general will see you at noon." General Edmund Hale was standing when she entered his study. This was the first thing that surprised her. Men of his position almost always received household staff while seated. The height difference made the arrangement of power clear from the very first moment, and powerful men tended to appreciate clarity. But General Hale was standing at the window with his back half turned, looking out at the elm garden, and when he faced her, the whole room seemed to rearrange itself around him like water settling after something had moved through it. He was tall and lean, dark hair with silver at the temples. His face was the kind that time and discipline had shaped into something that was not exactly handsome, but was extremely difficult to look away from. He wore no uniform, plain dark trousers, a white shirt, no jacket. And yet he occupied the room the way men who have commanded things occupy rooms, without trying, without thinking about it, as if the space had simply agreed ahead of time to belong to him. His eyes were dark and direct, and they moved over her with no social softening whatsoever. He was not rude. He was simply not pretending. "Miss Webb," he said. "General Hale." He was already holding her letter. He had already read it. She could tell by the way he held it. Finished, not in progress. "You served the Lowell family in Charlottesville for 4 years. They provided no reference." No. He waited. Most people filled silences when he waited. Clara did not. "Why not?" he said. "The Lowell family lost their money. The household was dissolved. There was no one left to write a letter, so I wrote my own." She held his gaze. "Everything in it is accurate." He looked at her for a long moment, not the performed consideration of a man making a decision he had already made. Real consideration, the kind with actual weight behind it. "Mrs. Thorne says you asked why the last maid left." "I did." "Most applicants don't ask that." "Most applicants don't want to know," Clara said. "I do." Something moved across his face, not softening. Something more precise than that. The way a careful instrument adjusts when it encounters something it did not expect. "She found the quiet difficult," he said. "I keep a still house. I do not require conversation, commentary, or company. I require competence and discretion." He set the letter down. "The position pays $12 a month. Sundays free. Your room is on the 3rd floor, east side. You start Friday." Clara was nearly at the door when his voice came again. "Miss Webb." She turned. "I also require honesty," he said. He was not looking at her. He had already turned back to his desk, pen moving. "If something is wrong in this house, I want to know. I have no patience for people who tell me what I want to hear." "That won't be a problem," Clara said. She left. He did not look up, and standing in the hallway with Mrs. Thorne, who had been waiting with the expression of a woman who had learned not to predict anything about this house, Clara thought about those last words. Not the job, not the salary, those words specifically. "I have no patience for people who tell me what I want to hear." She had worked in 4 households in 9 years. Not one of the men who ran them had ever said that to her. She had no idea yet what it meant, but she thought about it all the way back down the elm-lined path, and she was still thinking about it when the iron gate closed behind her. She learned him the way you learn a house in winter, carefully, by feel, in the dark, not his preferences. Those came quickly. Dinner at 7, precise to the minute. Meat simply prepared, no heavy sauces. Bread that had been properly baked, not merely edible. Water, not wine, with his meals. These were the surface details, and Clara catalogued them efficiently in her first 2 days without needing to be told twice. What took longer was learning the shape of the man underneath. The study light came on before 5 every morning. She knew this because her room was on the east side of the 3rd floor, directly above the study, and the faint line of light that crept under her door each dawn was his, not the sun. He was always awake first. By the time she came downstairs, he had already been up for hours, moving through the house, in a silence so complete it was almost a sound of its own. He walked the elm garden every morning for exactly 20 minutes, regardless of weather. She discovered this on her 3rd day when she looked out the kitchen window at 5:30 and saw him moving along the path in a light rain, coat open, hat off, completely unbothered. Not punishing himself, not performing discipline, simply walking the way a man walks, when movement is the only thing that quiets whatever lives inside his head. She did not ask about it. There were 4 other staff members. Mrs. Thorne managed the house with the focused efficiency of someone running a small military operation. Thomas, the groundskeeper, was a quiet older man who had worked the property since the general's father owned it, and who spoke mostly to his tools. Ada, the kitchen girl, was 17, quick-handed, and so frightened of the general that she went slightly rigid whenever she heard his footsteps in the corridor. And then there was Saul. Saul had served with the general during the war. He had the calm face of a man who had seen a great deal and decided to stop being surprised by things. He was not unfriendly. He was simply economical, as if he had measured out his words a long time ago and was spending them carefully. It was Saul who told her the things she actually needed to know. "He doesn't sleep much," Saul said one evening, passing through the back hallway with a lamp in his hand. He said it without preamble, the way he said everything, as if the conversation had already been going on for some time inside his head. Some nights not at all. If you hear him moving through the house at 2 or 3 in the morning, that is ordinary. Don't light extra lamps on his account. He prefers the dark when he can't sleep. "Is it from the war?" Clara asked. Saul was quiet for a moment. "There's no particular thing from the war, just the war in general. He came back different." He adjusted the lamp in his hand. Not broken, just quieter, like something that used to be loud in him got turned all the way down, and he's been living at that volume ever since. He walked away. Clara stood in the hallway and thought about a man who had come home from years of war with something turned down inside him, and had been living in the quiet of it so long that he had probably stopped noticing it himself. She went upstairs to her room. She told herself it was none of her business. She mostly believed it. 11 days into her time at Ashton Lane, she burned the dinner. It was not carelessness, and she needed that to be clear, even if only to herself, even if no one would ever ask. She had been managing the roast and 3 side dishes at once, and she had also, finally, opened a letter from her sister Ruth that had arrived 4 days earlier, and that she had been putting off reading because Ruth's letters always required a certain amount of preparation. The letter said their father's creditors had moved again. It said Ruth's landlord had raised the rent by 1/4. It said the last piece of land the Webb family had once owned, a small plot in the hill country that had been in the family for 60 years, was now gone. Sold to settle a debt their father had made 6 years before his death and never once mentioned to either of his daughters. Clara read this standing at the kitchen counter. The roast burned, not badly, not to ruin, but the edges had gone darker than they should, and the smell had shifted from rich to sharp. And she knew the moment she lifted the lid that it was wrong. She stood there for a moment, holding that information. Then she looked at the clock. 7 o'clock was 7 o'clock. She plated the dinner and carried it to the dining room, and she set it in front of him, and she met his eyes and said nothing. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. "This is burned." "Yes." He waited. The silence between them was not empty. It was very full, actually, full of the specific weight of a man who was used to things being done correctly, and a woman who had just not done it correctly, and both of them knowing it. "You're not going to apologize," he said. It was not quite a question. An apology would suggest I don't know what I did, or that I expect to be forgiven if it happens again. Neither is true. She held his gaze without difficulty. "It won't happen again." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork and ate the dinner, burned edges and all, and said nothing further. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter and breathed for a moment. Then she sliced fresh bread, carried it to the table without being asked, and he ate that too. When she came to clear the plates, he was reading a letter, and his water glass was, for once, not sitting untouched at the edge of the table. That evening, Saul appeared in the kitchen doorway. "What did you say to him at dinner?" Clara looked up. "About what?" "He mentioned it to me afterward." Saul leaned against the doorframe. "He said you didn't apologize. He said it the way he says things when he's still working them out in his mind." "It was just a burned roast," Clara said. Saul was quiet for a moment. "In this house," he said finally, "it is never just anything." He pushed off the doorframe. "That's all I'm going to say." He left. Clara turned back to the kitchen and stood there in the quiet, and she thought about a man who had not slept properly since a war that had turned something down inside him, who had eaten a burned dinner without complaint, and who had apparently found her refusal to apologize notable enough to mention. She did not know what to do with that. She went upstairs. She lay in her room on the east side of the 3rd floor, the quiet side, and she listened to the house settle around her. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. Footsteps moved through a corridor and then went still. She had been in this house for 11 days. Something was already different about it. She couldn't name it yet. She wasn't sure she wanted to, but she thought as she finally closed her eyes that whatever it was, it had started the moment she walked into that study and refused to fill the silence. And that it had not stopped since. Nobody warned Clara about the letter. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon, tucked between a bill from the butcher and a note from Mrs. Thorne about bed linens. Clara recognized her sister Ruth's handwriting immediately. She set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long moment before she touched it. Letters from Ruth were never simple. They were never short, and they were never good news. She should have waited. She knew that. She had a roast in the oven, vegetables on the fire, and General Edmund Hale expected his dinner at precisely 7 o'clock. He had never once been late to the table, and in 11 days of working at Ashton Lane, neither had his food. Clara had a record to protect, but she opened the letter anyway. Ruth's words came fast and hard, the way bad news always does. Their father's creditors had filed paperwork again. Ruth's landlord had raised the rent by an amount that made Clara's stomach drop. And the small piece of land out in the county, the last thing the Webb family still had to their name, the piece of earth their grandfather had worked his whole life, was gone. Sold off. Done. Nothing left. Clara stood very still at the counter. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, set it down, and turned back to the stove. She was too late. She could smell it before she even lifted the lid. That particular sharp smell of something that has crossed the line between cooked and ruined. The roast had gone dark at the edges. The juices dried up in the pan. The whole thing sitting in the oven like evidence against her. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the clock. It was 1 minute to 7. There was no time to start again. There was nothing to do but carry it to the table. She set the dish down in front of General Hale and took 1 step back. He looked at the plate. He looked at the meat. Then he looked up at her with those steady dark eyes that never seemed to miss a single thing. "This is burned," he said. "Yes," Clara said. That was all she said. Most people would have rushed to explain. Most people would have mentioned the letter, the land, the sister, the grief sitting like a stone in the middle of their chest. Most people would have apologized before he even asked for one. Clara did none of those things. She stood with her hands folded and held his gaze and waited. He waited too. The room was very quiet. The fire crackled once. Outside, wind moved through the elm trees with a low, steady sound. General Hale set down his fork slowly and the silence between them stretched out like something being measured. "You're not going to apologize," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Apologizing would mean one of two things," Clara said. "Either I didn't know what I was doing, or I plan to do it again and want to be forgiven in advance. Neither one is true. Neither one is." Something crossed his face then. It was small. Most people would have missed it. But Clara had spent 11 days learning this man's face, and she caught it, that slight shift behind his eyes, like a door opening just a crack before someone remembers to close it again. He picked up his fork. He ate the burned roast without another word. Clara brought bread from the kitchen without being asked, and he ate that too. She cleared the table. She said nothing. He said nothing. And when she finally walked back down the corridor toward the kitchen, she let out a breath so slow and quiet that it barely made a sound. Saul was leaning against the kitchen door frame when she got there. "He told her about it at dinner," Saul said. Clara stopped walking. "Told you what?" "What you said. About the apology." Saul poured himself a glass of water, calm as anything. He said it the way he says things he hasn't finished thinking about yet. Clara looked at him. It was just a burned roast. Saul set down his glass. "In this house," he said, "it is never just a burned roast." He walked out. Clara stood at the counter and turned that sentence over in her mind several times. She was still thinking about it when she went upstairs to her room that night, still thinking about it when she lay in the dark and listened to the elm trees moving outside. General Edmund Hale had not laughed in 6 years. Saul had told her that in the same flat, certain voice he used for facts that were not up for debate. 6 years of quiet, 6 years of dinners eaten alone at a table built for 8. 6 years of a man pressing everything down until the pressing became ordinary. Clara had not been trying to do anything about that. She wanted to be very clear about this, if only to herself. She had burned the roast because of a letter. She had refused to apologize because it was the honest thing to do. That was all. There was nothing calculated about any of it. But 3 days later, she made an error so spectacular, so thoroughly, completely wrong, that it stopped General Edmund Hale in the doorway of the dining room. And something happened in his face that Clara had never seen before. It started with a pot of soup that had boiled too long, a bread roll that came out of the oven shaped like something from the bottom of a river, and a custard that had gone from liquid to something closer to mortar. She was standing at the table, looking at all three, when she heard his footstep behind her. She turned around. He looked at the bread roll. He pressed his mouth closed, and then, quietly, like a sound escaping from somewhere it had been locked for a very long time, he laughed. Clara did not sleep well that night. She lay in her room on the east side of the house and stared at the ceiling and told herself very firmly that what she had seen on General Hale's face was nothing more than a man reacting to an unusually bad dinner. She told herself this several times. She used her most practical, no-nonsense internal voice, the one she had developed over years of managing situations that had no good solutions. She was quite convincing. She still did not sleep, because the thing about that laugh, the thing she could not file away neatly no matter how hard she tried, was how surprised he had looked by it. Not surprised at the bad food, surprised at himself. Like a man who had reached into his pocket for something ordinary and found something he had forgotten was even in there. By the time the clock downstairs struck 5, Clara was already dressed. She went down to the kitchen and put the kettle on and started work, and she did not let herself think about it anymore. That was the rule she set. That was the only sensible way forward. The rule lasted about 4 days, because General Hale started coming downstairs earlier. It was not dramatic. There was no announcement, no change in routine that anyone could have pointed to and named out loud. But the study light, which had always come on at 5, began appearing at 4:30, and the sound of footsteps on the staircase, which she had grown used to hearing around 6, started arriving before the kettle had even boiled. And on the 5th morning, when Clara turned around with a pot of tea in her hand, he was already sitting at the far end of the dining table, with a book open in front of him, not reading it. She set a cup near him without being asked. He didn't thank her. She didn't expect him to, but he stayed at the table while she worked, and the room had a different quality to it when he was in it, stiller somehow, like everything had agreed to hold its breath. This went on for 3 weeks. It was quiet and ordinary and completely unlike anything Clara had ever experienced in a household before. Then, on the first Friday of December, Victoria Crane arrived for dinner. Clara heard the carriage before she saw anything. That particular sound of expensive wheels on a good road, a door that opened and closed with the precision of something that had cost a great deal of money. She stayed in the kitchen. The dining room was not her world. Her world had a stove in it. But houses are porous things. Sound travels through walls, the way water travels through old stone, slowly and completely. And what Clara heard from the kitchen that evening was the sound of a woman who had never once in her life wondered whether she was worth listening to. Victoria Crane's voice was clear and confident, and it carried through 2 doors and a corridor without any apparent effort. She spoke about a theater performance in London, about an upcoming government dinner she expected to attend, about the decoration of a mutual acquaintance's townhouse, in a tone that made it sound like a professional judgment rather than an opinion. She spoke to General Hale the way a person speaks to something they have already decided belongs to them. The general's voice was quieter. Clara could hear the rhythm of it, measured and courteous, without being able to make out the words. He was present in the room and somewhere else at the same time. Clara knew that voice. She had been listening to it for weeks. It was not the same voice she heard at 4:30 in the morning at the end of the dining table. She sent the pudding out at 9 and waited for Mrs. Thorne to come back with the empty dishes. Miss Crane asked who made it, Mrs. Thorne said, setting the plates down. What did he say? Mrs. Thorne looked at her steadily. He said, my maid. He said it the way a man states a fact he considers important. She paused. He also said she was worth every penny. I have not heard him say that about any member of staff in the time I have worked in this house. Clara washed the dishes and did not think about it. She was very disciplined about not thinking about things that would cause her difficulty. She was not entirely successful. Victoria Crane came back the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and by the 3rd visit, she had begun expressing opinions about the household to Mrs. Thorne in a warm, pleasant voice that was somehow worse than if she had been openly rude. The soup was perhaps slightly heavy for the season. She did hope the maid had been properly instructed in the general's preferences, rather than simply guessing at them. She mentioned almost in passing to young Ada that it was unwise to grow too fond of staff who might not be permanent fixtures. Mrs. Thorne told Clara all of it, directly, without softening it. She is building something, Mrs. Thorne said, not against your work, against your presence. Clara kept her eyes on the silver she was polishing. What do you want me to do about it? Nothing, Clara said. I'm going to keep doing my work. Mrs. Thorne watched her. She is not going to stop. I know. Clara set down the polishing cloth. Let her keep going. I am not going to give her anything to work with. What she did not say, what she turned over privately in her mind that night, in the quiet of her room, was something that Saul had told her that same afternoon in his plain, unhurried way, standing in the corridor with his arms folded. "He is not going to ask her," Saul said. "I have known this man for 11 years. I know what he looks like when he has made up his mind. He made up his mind about that woman some time ago. The answer was no. He just has not said it out loud yet." Clara had looked at him. Then what is he waiting for? Saul had been quiet for a long moment. "He is waiting," he said carefully, to be sure about something else entirely. He walked away before she could ask what he meant. But the next morning, General Hale came downstairs at 4:15, which was earlier than he had ever come before, and he sat at the end of the table, and he looked at Clara across the room with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before. Not commanding, not contained, just honest. She poured his tea and waited, and the house held its breath around both of them. Nobody told Clara that saying yes to a man like General Edmund Hale would feel like stepping into the middle of a storm she hadn't seen coming. She found out on her own. It started small, a cold look from a woman at the market who had always been perfectly pleasant before. A note slipped under Mrs. Thorne's door from one of the neighboring households, asking politely whether the staff situation at Ashton Lane had been properly resolved. Then Saul told her that 2 men he recognized from the Hartwell circle had been asking questions around town about how long she had worked there and where she had come from before that. Clara kept her hands busy. She always kept her hands busy when she was thinking hard about something. She was setting the fire in the east hallway when Mrs. Thorne found her, letter in hand, with the expression of a woman who had something to say and was choosing her words carefully. Victoria Crane had written to the household registry in Portsmouth, where Clara had once been listed. The letter was polite on the surface. It used words like concern and welfare, and simply wanted to ensure. But underneath all of that, it said one thing clearly. Clara Webb was not who she appeared to be. Mrs. Thorne set the letter on the hall table without a word. Clara read it. She set it back down. She had read letters like this before. Not about herself, but about other women she had known. Women who had stepped outside the lane that had been drawn for them and had found a letter waiting on the other side of it. The letter never had to say anything true. It only had to make people unsure. Clara went back to the fire. She pressed the coal into place with the iron and felt the heat come up against her hands. She was not angry. She was something colder than angry and more useful. General Hale came home that evening and found her in the sitting room, not working, just sitting, which she almost never did. He stopped in the doorway the way he always stopped in doorways, reading the room before he entered it. He sat across from her without being asked. He looked at her steadily. She told him about the letter. She told him plainly, the way she did everything, without dressing it up or making it smaller than it was. He listened without interrupting. His face did not move. She had learned by now that his stillness was not the same as coldness. It was something else entirely. It was a man deciding exactly what to do before he did it. When she finished, he rose from the chair. He crossed to the small writing desk in the corner of the room and opened the top drawer. He came back with a folded paper and set it on the table between them. She unfolded it. It was a letter, his handwriting. She knew it well enough by now, having seen it on house accounts and brief notes left when he was called away. It was brief, direct, no decoration. It was addressed to Lord Whitmore of Portsmouth, dated 4 days earlier, before she had ever told him about Victoria Crane's letter. It stated plainly that any inquiry regarding the character or conduct of Miss Clara Webb, formerly of Yorkshire, should be directed to General Edmund Hale at Ashton Lane, Richmond, and that the General would take a personal interest in any account that sought to misrepresent her. "You wrote this before I told you," she said. "Yes. How did you know?" He looked at her. "Because I knew her," he said. "And I knew she would come for you rather than for me. That is what people do when they cannot reach the person they are actually angry with." He paused. I was not going to wait for the damage to arrive before I acted. Clara held the letter for a moment. She looked at the fire. She looked at this man who sat across from her, who had not made a single romantic promise, who had not said anything that was not true, who had simply, quietly, put himself in front of the thing coming toward her before she had even seen it move. "You didn't tell me," she said. "No." "Why not?" "Because I did not want you to feel that your answer to me was something I had bought." He held her eyes. "You told me you needed time. I was not going to spend that time building a debt between us." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Richmond moved through its December dark. A cart went by on the lane. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked once and then went still. The fire popped and settled. "I have had my time," she said. He went very still. "I have thought about every reasonable reason why this is difficult," she said. "I have thought about what I have, and what I don't have, and what this house is, and what it is not, and what people will say." She held his gaze. "And I have thought about what it has been like to be in a room with someone who tells me the truth, even when it is inconvenient for him." She paused. "And what it felt like to be the only one in the room when you laughed." He rose from the chair. He crossed to her side of the room, unhurried, and he stood before her and looked at her the way he looked at everything that mattered. "I would like to ask you something," he said. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said. He stopped. "I had not finished. You did not need to." Something moved in his face. The door opened again, the same one she had seen, crack open over a ruined roast and a burned pot, except this time it did not close. He took her hands in both of his, and he asked her properly, and she said yes again, properly, and the sitting room at Ashton Lane held that moment the way old rooms hold the things that matter, quietly and for a long time. 3 months after the wedding, Clara burned something again, not by accident this time, by distraction, which was different, and which she found oddly fitting. She had been reading a letter from her sister Ruth, who had written to say that she was well, that the rent had been managed, that there was perhaps a small piece of hope where the land in the county was concerned. Clara had stood at the kitchen range with that letter in her hand, and the soup had gone too long on the heat and thickened past where it should have been. She heard footsteps in the corridor. Edmund came to the kitchen doorway in the way he always came, hands at his sides, reading the room before he entered it. He looked at the pot. He looked at her face. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. "I see," he said. "It is still edible," she said. "Is it?" She considered this honestly, mostly. He came into the kitchen, which he did now without hesitation, without standing in the doorway, waiting for permission from a room he lived in. He sat at the table. She ladled the soup into a bowl and set it before him without apology, because they had established, early and firmly, that apologies in this house were reserved for things that would not be repeated, and some things, she had decided, were allowed to happen twice. He tasted it. He set down the spoon. He looked at her. "It is not as good as the last disaster," he said. "The last disaster was a roast." "I remember. You laughed," she said. He looked at her. Yes. She sat down across from him. "You hadn't laughed in years before that. You told me so yourself." He was quiet for a moment. He turned his spoon over in his hand, looking at it. "I told you," he said, "that it had been some time." "I did not say years. You meant years." He looked up. "Yes," he said simply. "I meant years." The kitchen was warm around them. The fire in the grate was doing what fires do in February in Richmond, working hard and without complaint. Outside, the elm trees in the garden were bare and gray against a white sky, and the lane was quiet, and the whole house had the particular stillness of a Saturday morning when no one was expected and nothing was required. Clara wrapped her hands around her tea. She looked at this man across the table, dressed plainly, no uniform, no formal coat. Just a man at a kitchen table in his own house, holding a soup spoon, looking back at her. She thought about the posting she had answered. Cook wanted, experienced, discreet. She thought about the carpetbag she had carried through the iron gate. She thought about writing her own letter of reference because there was no one else left to write it, and signing her own name to it, and walking up the path toward a house that had looked inevitable and beautiful in the way of things that do not yet belong to you. She had not expected any of this. She had not expected the stillness of the study light before dawn. She had not expected a man who argued with her about tradesmen's prices and then conceded the point cleanly, without theater. She had not expected to be the only person in a room when a door opened in someone's face that had been shut for 6 years. She had not expected to matter. Ruth's letter was still in her apron pocket. She thought about what it had said. Small hope where the land in the county was concerned. Not large hope. Not a certainty. Just a small one, which was more than there had been before, and which Ruth had written about without fuss, the way their family had always handled small hopes, by noting them and getting back to work. Clara had learned something, living in this house, that the getting back to work was not the lesser thing, that the ordinary days, the ones without events, the Tuesday mornings and the quiet evenings and the fire that needed laying and the soup that went too long on the heat, those were not the spaces between the real life. They were the real life, and the people you spent them with were the whole of it. Edmund pushed the soup bowl to one side. He looked at her across the table with the full and direct attention that had always been his way, the gaze that did not soften things unnecessarily and did not harden them either. "Your sister," he said. "She is well?" Clara felt something settle in her chest, quiet and solid. He had seen the letter in her hand when he came to the doorway. He had noticed. He always noticed. "She is better," Clara said. "She will be well." He nodded once. Good. He picked up his spoon again. He finished the soup, the thickened, slightly overcooked soup that she had made while reading her sister's letter by the fire, in the kitchen of a house that had a study light that came on before dawn, and elm trees that were old enough to have known the previous generation, and a man who had come back from a war with something turned down inside him that had slowly, over the course of a ruined roast, and an argument about fish prices, and 100 small, honest mornings, been turned back up again. She cleared the bowl. She went back to the range. He stayed at the table, and she worked around him, and the kitchen held its warmth, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. But when she finally set the last dish aside and turned to bank the fire, he said quietly from his chair, without looking up from the letter he had begun to read, "That soup was better than you said it was." She did not turn around. It truly was not. She heard the sound she had been carrying with her since November, warm, real, present. She smiled at the fire. Outside, Richmond moved through its February morning, gray and unhurried, and at 9 Ashton Lane the kitchen held its warmth, and the day continued the way their days continued now. Together, in the ordinary and quietly chosen life, they had both, against every expectation, decided to keep.